My name is Pat. This is my first and possibly going to be my only YouTube video. Like most of you who are watching, if you're going to attempt something automotive you've never tried before, you're probably going to refer to YouTube, see if someone else has done it, and see how it went for them. Well, what we're working on today, I couldn't find on YouTube, and I could find very little other information. There was a couple of threads on some forums, and a couple of those were quite helpful, but there was still no videos, so I thought, you know what, why not? So, I'm not a professional at making videos. I'm not a professional at working on vehicles. I have 40 plus years experience, I'll say tinkering with them as an automotive enthusiast, working on my own cars, working on cars for family and friends. But again, this is something that I have not done before as far as what we're doing today. I'm going to be taking apart and replacing the bearings in a motor generator unit off of a 2019 Dodge Ram with a 5.7 Hemi. Now, these are on back order with Chrysler, and they're quite expensive, and the only thing wrong with this one is it needs bearings. It's making a lot of whining noise according to my friend who brought this over, and no, I put bearings in alternators before and it's not that big of a deal, but I usually don't do that because it's better just to buy a new one. In this case, because of the price of a new one and the unavailability of them, we're going to try to put bearings in. So this is not an instructional video. This is simply for you to see how it went for me. So with that being said, let's get into it. As you can see here, I've already taken the drive pulley off, but this is how I did it. I had to use a bearing splitter so I didn't damage the pulley. I put this under a lot more pressure than I thought I would have to, because this shaft is not keyed, it's simply tapered and pressed on. I ended up using, again, my bearing splitter with the puller. I put it under a lot of pressure, almost to the point I thought this was going to break, and then I ended up spinning it about 2 revolutions per second while applying some gentle heat from a propane torch. The pulley had to heat up to almost 300 degrees before it finally let go. Next, we're going to use let me see here, a T30 socket to remove this, what appears to be a grounding strap between the generator unit itself and the computer. I like to keep the bolts with it. We'll set it aside. Next, let's take this back cover off using a T20. Again, set that aside with the bolts in it. We just take the top ones off. Slowed down there because that one wanted to get hung up, it felt like. Small locking tab here on the harness. Go. Now let's separate the control module on top from the generator unit itself. Again, it's going to be a T20. I don't know if my 3/8 drive socket will work here. It's not getting on there bolt very straight, and we don't want to strip these out. This is Heidi. She's my rodent control unit here in my shop. She tries to be helpful, but she is not. Again, going slow and deliberate. Don't want to have any of these bolts stick on me and then break them off. Don't lose the 4 spacers, the standoffs for that unit. There's a snap ring on the end of the shaft I'll have to remove. Heidi, you're in the way. Now the bolts that hold the case together, definitely going to put some penetrating oil on those. I'm going to use my handy Sharpie marker here to mark the orientation of the case. So when it comes time to put it back together, we can clock it correctly. Pardon that noise, that's my notifications on my phone. Sounds like it's going to be a busy day for me at work with all the notifications coming in. Hopefully, go through the holes nice. Remember, we got that the three-side socket here, I'm not able to get perfectly straight on this screw. So let's try pulling in there as far as I can to close this up. Well, let's see if we can get this to come apart. I'll start out being very careful with this. We don't want to break any of these castings. Oh. We'll hang on to that too. It's a little bit harder this time. Here's the alarm coming out, so it's not falling out shaft here. Yes. I'll take some out. That's okay, it's happening anyway. I'd rather just the full front face. I need to get work here, so I'll 15 minutes later. So as you can see, it came apart eventually. I just had to keep pounding with the rubber mallet so I didn't damage anything. This rear bearing is definitely shot. I can barely turn it with my hands, it's so sticky. It also has a snap ring on it to hold it in place. Let's see how that comes off. Okay, the bearing doesn't want to come off, at least willingly. front pulley. Let me grab a couple blocks of wood to set this casing up on, and then I'll start by gently wrapping on the end of the shaft with a rubber mallet, see if it comes loose, and we may have to get more aggressive with it depending on how much it wants to fight. Okay, that's not going to work. We'll have to get a little bit more persuasive. I'd find just the right punch that would bottom out inside the shaft using a brass hammer. Okay, that doesn't want to cooperate either. I guess it's time to utilize the hydraulic shop press. As you can see, I've got it rigged up in the shop press now. Normally I wouldn't use board standing up on edge like this. That is not safe. So don't do that. But I figured this probably won't take a ton of pressure, so it should be alright. You'll also notice I put the nut back on the end of the pulley shaft to protect the threads. Yeah, that is taking quite a bit of pressure. I may have to re-rig this so it's a little bit safer for me to use. Okay, take two. I've got it rigged up a little more safe now. Safely. And hopefully this doesn't fight too much. Yeah, I don't know if that would have come out with just a hammer. That took quite a bit of pressure on the press here to get the shaft pressed out of the bearing. I'll go remove this and I'll find a, I guess I don't need to find a socket. The bore is big enough, the press will just drop right down in there. As you can see, I removed the shaft. There was a snap ring right here, keeping that bearing in place inside the case. So we'll press that out now. Have that. That probably would have come out with some tapping on the bench with a hammer though. That wasn't pressed in very hard. Alright, let's get these surfaces cleaned up and the new bearings installed. As you can see, there's some corrosion on where the bearing and the bore right there for the bearing. There's also some corrosion on the aluminum here. I would normally use a pneumatic wire wheel to clean surfaces, but since this is aluminum, I don't want to get that aggressive with it. I just want to take the corrosion off, not the aluminum. I don't want to damage the aluminum case. That's not recommended. There we go. brush might actually be a little too aggressive. Starting to scratch the aluminum case. Now, I purchased my bearings at a local store that specializes in bearings and belts and things like that for industry, agriculture, whatever. If you don't have a store like that, you can probably look up these bearing numbers online. The large bearing, well, here's the part number for the large bearing, 6305, and the small bearing is 6003. I believe the gentleman at the counter said that's a standard alternator bearing. Alright, let's get this pressed in. Keeping it aligned with the outside edge of the bearing. As you can see, it's taking very little pressure to get that in. Rather than pounding it and risking getting it crooked, I like to press them in and they stay nice and straight. Feel a little bit of resistance and it should be there. Installed. Snap ring back in. Maybe use a larger snap ring pliers here. Has a hard time spanning that distance. There we go. Make sure that's seated all the way down, which it is. When I get a little bit of fine emery cloth, we'll polish up that shaft so it should slide nicely into the bearing. Or we may have to press that in too. Let's find out. There we go. Take a little persuasion to get that on there, looks like. Find a socket that'll slide nicely over that. And we'll see if we can drive that on gently. Again, we don't want to damage anything on the bottom of the shaft either. So we'll thread this nut back on, protect the threads. Don't want any of those to get crushed. Run that down until it's flush. And we need to go a little bit further, so I'll have to find a bigger socket. No, it looks like we'll have to press that on too. It doesn't want to go on. Yeah, we need to get that down far enough to show us the groove where the retaining snap ring goes on. So let me rig this up in the press and we'll get that pressed on. Here we are with the press again. Found a socket that will ride on this inner bearing race to press that on nicely onto the shaft. In this case I'm using a 30 millimeter. It'd be nice if it was a little bit smaller, but I don't have anything for that. Sound like it moved. Let's check it and see if we can see our groove for the retaining snap ring. Just about. We'll give it just a touch more. There we go. Now we can see our groove for the snap ring. And as you can see, the cooling fans blades dug into the wood just a little bit, but that's okay. That's why I place them on wood, so we don't damage the aluminum fins. Alright, let's get the snap ring put back on. There we go. Make sure you hear a little click. That tells you that it's dropped into the groove. Now let's get that rear bearing on. Alright, I'm going to have to try that on too. what? I have a better idea. I picked up a tool online that I think will help us out here. This is a bearing heater. First I got to make sure it's switched on. What it does, you set the bearing on there for a few minutes, monitoring the temperature with a device something like this. And you heat the bearing up just enough so it'll expand, and it'll just drop it onto that shaft. There we go, we're heating up, so this will be a few minutes. Now that the bearing heater is up to temp, we're getting there. We'll set this bearing on top, give that about 5 minutes. Once that bearing is around 200 degrees, I should be able to just pick it up with gloves on, obviously, and just set it right on that shaft. It'll drop right down and nest and seat, and within just a moment or two, it'll be cool enough it won't slide back off. If I'd been able to do that with the larger front bearing, I would have done that, but obviously I can't get to the snap ring if I would have installed it onto the shaft first. Now, being as hot as it is, let's see if it's hot enough yet. Just slide right on. No, not quite. No, I can't get it back off. Well, maybe it's warm enough we can just tap it down there. There we go. Felt that seat down there nicely, so not exactly how I planned on for it to work, but it worked. Let me shut this off, set it out of the way so it can cool, so I don't run my arm into it. Get that snap ring back on. It's one of those jobs where you want to make sure you don't have any leftover parts when you're done. Each one plays a very crucial role. Now, if you don't have a bearing heater, you can always use a small toaster oven. You can pick those up at secondhand stores fairly inexpensively, and it sure makes installing bearings much easier. Again, just don't overheat the bearings. Usually around 200 degrees or so is sufficient. Alright, I believe we're ready to put the case back together and get it reassembled. If you recall, I put a little mark on here, so I make sure the front half and the back half of the case are aligned as they were. Don't want to have to pound it back apart again. Gently slide that on there. Make sure things line up. We got to get that inner rear bearing lined up with the bore in the back of the case. And looks like we'll have to gently persuade that on now that we've got our marks lined up. Oh, never mind. It just dropped right together. How nice. That's the advantage of cleaning the corrosion off the edges before you put it back together. Did twist just a little bit. Massage that over so the mark lines up. There we go. Now I did take the 4 bolts that hold the case together, the 2 halves of the case together. I did clean the threads up on the wire wheel. And I grabbed some blue Loctite or a thread locker. I just don't know where I set it. Let me go find that. There we are. I thought I grabbed it. I did not. When I cleaned these threads off, I noticed there was a little bit of thread locker on the threads from the factory. So we'll put some back on there. Just a drop will do. This is subject to a lot of heat cycles as well as vibration, and we don't want these bolts coming loose. I actually had that happen one time on a brand new alternator. And of course I was driving on the interstate at night on a Sunday night in the middle of a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere with my wife, who was about 11 months pregnant at the time. So there was no stress involved when my lights started to flicker. But I did get that taken care of. One of the bolts in the alternator case had backed out just while driving. I'd put the alternator on 2 days prior to that. Fortunately, by the grace of possibly even a higher power, I was able to find a small service station just off the interstate at 1 in the morning on a Sunday night. The owner just happened to be there doing his books and allowed me to come in and take my alternator off and put the bolts back in. The bolt that had worked its way out was just sitting on top of the alternator, and another one was hanging halfway out. Normally my wife would freak out if she saw me working on an engine or an alternator wearing a white dress shirt, but I had no choice at that time as I was coming home from my grandmother's funeral. So, to make a long story long, that's why we're putting a little bit of Loctite on these bolts. There, now that they're all in, I will walk it down so it's all straight. No need for these to be over tightened. We don't want to break the bolts. I did not look up any torque specifications for these. I doubt there's any out there, but if anybody finds them, you can certainly put it in the comments for the next guy. There, I'll call that wrist tight. Now that that's snugged up, let's make sure we still spin nicely. Yes, very nice. Line this up with the keyway. It's just like a little magnet. I'm guessing this communicates with the computer, telling it the position and or RPM of the shaft. Excuse me. Some sort of a reluctor type device. I think that was on there with about 2 UGGs on my little impact gun. Alright, let's remount the control module. Which, by the way, also had some thread lock on the screws. So we'll put a drop on each one of those. Not forgetting our spacers, our standoffs here. And like the case bolts, I also cleaned up the threads on these screws as well. Always a good idea, so they go back in nice and easy. I don't know if you can tell with my camera here, but the corrosion or the oxidation level on the case on the control module is much more than on this case, which tells me this has probably been replaced already once. My friend's truck has about 130,000 miles on it. So that tells me that the bearings probably aren't that great from the factory, so that's why we're replacing them now, because they were making an awful lot of noise. Now, if you're running across the same situation with a lot of bearing whine noise coming from this system, of course you always want to make sure that your pulleys are in good shape. Your tensioner pulleys, and actually there's just 2 tensioners on this. I'm also going to be replacing those. This is the lower tensioner pulley. See the part number there. Looks like this. Not an easy part number to find. The upper tensioner pulley is even harder to find because Chrysler does not sell that without buying the entire tensioner. This one, the tensioner is just fine. The spring tension is good. It moves very freely. But I was able to find a Dorman pulley that matches. Will look like this. And here's that Dorman part number. I will also be replacing the belt, as my friend said, since you're there anyway, and I'm going to have everything apart. So let me double check these bolts, make sure my wrist, it has them torqued properly. Yep. Yep, they're all good. Now, let's put this back together. Oops. I got these contacts trapped underneath that, so I get to loosen the control module again. See, this is why we watch YouTube videos, so you can learn from someone else's mistakes. And we can plug the harness back in. It doesn't want to engage fully, so maybe I'll put just a touch of dielectric grease on that seal. Help that slide in and engage a little bit easier. Just a very thin film. There we go. Lock the retainer. Put the screws back in the contacts and these three lugs. It is very soft. It won't take much to bend it back so it reaches, so it's aligned properly. As you can see by this, another mistake I made, I would not have had to have loosened these bottom three screws. I think I would have been just fine just taking the top screws out to remove that. So if I had to do it all over again, which I hope I don't, but if I do, I'll try that next time. Just loosening these three top screws and not even loosening the bottom ones. twist. Again, very soft. That one, if you recall, doesn't have a nut on the bottom. It actually has like a small threaded ring that's bonded to the tab down here. That did break loose as I was loosening it, so I need to hang on to that as I tighten this up. And very gently. Probably also made of copper. We don't want to crush it. And that still wants to spin. Yep. Pry that up just a little bit so I can get better access. I don't want to let go. There we go. Good and snug. Twist it just a little bit. We'll get that back into place. Not that it matters, but it matters to me. Put the rear cover back on. These don't need to be very tight. All they're doing is holding on this thin metal cover just tight enough so they don't want to come loose. Or start rattling. And reinstall our ground strap. And the drive pulley. And again, that's 24 millimeters. Perfect torque. All that That spins much, much nicer than it did before. Alright. I'm all out of parts, which means we're done. I'm going to reinstall this, and if I run across any noteworthy items while I'm reinstalling this, I will add the notes to the video. One thing to note though is this unit is pretty heavy. It's probably in the neighborhood of 30 pounds. And just be careful with your back lifting that in and out of the engine bay, because the engines these days sit so far back you have to reach quite a ways, and that's not good geometry for your back health. Anyway, thanks for watching. Again, if you leave comments, be nice about it. Even if it's criticisms, I'll take notes. If I've made mistakes, let me know. But don't be mean. There's too much of that online the way it is. Thank you very much, and good luck with your project.